As a biology professor, I often have the unenviable task of teaching lots and lots of plant names to students. One look at my student evaluations will show you what they think of that. But I wanted to spend a couple of minutes to tell you why these long scientific names are so useful. And I chose this eastern hemlock as an example to illustrate a point. So this is, again, eastern hemlock. And I tell my students, if you call this just hemlock, you're not going to get all the points. Hemlock is a different plant. Some of you might have heard of Socrates, the philosopher. He was sentenced to death and he had to make a tea out of a plant called hemlock. And specifically, it was poison hemlock. That hemlock is a flowering plant, completely unrelated to this non-flowering plant. The poison hemlock is in the carrot family. This is in the pine family. Again, totally unrelated, but their common name is very similar. Eastern hemlock versus poison hemlock. That's one of the problems with using common names, even though they're in some senses easier to use. So you can have two very different plants that have basically the same common name. Another problem with common names is you can have the same plant have different names in different parts of the country or different parts of the world. So instead of using common names, scientists will usually use the Latin name, the binomial. So this one is Tsuga canadensis. And those names are harder to learn maybe because they're a little more foreign to us. They're Latinized. But anybody anywhere in the world can look up Tsuga canadensis and know exactly which plant you're talking about. To give you a sense for how useful or important or sort of fundamental in a sense these names are, I want you to just take a minute and think about somebody special in your life. It could be your spouse, it could be one of your children or all of your children, it could be your best friend. Think of their name. When you think of that name, there's a whole bunch other stuff that's associated with that name in your mind. So by knowing that name, you know a whole bunch, it's associated with a whole bunch of stuff that you tie to that name. That same phenomenon can be applied to scientific names. By knowing the name of an organism, and it's the same name that everybody around the world would be familiar with or would at least be able to get to, you suddenly have access to everything that's known about that organism. So even though these are difficult to learn, I think it's really worth the time to just get out, study them, and focus on those Latin names when you can. Since we just talked about the death of the great philosopher Socrates, I thought this might be a good opportunity to tell you about how the field of philosophy may actually be a much more dangerous profession even than the field of botany. Let me tell you about the loss of one other great philosopher, René Descartes. Descartes is famous for, among other things, for the "I think, therefore I am" statement. And so he met his demise when a friend dropped by and asked him, "Mr. Descartes, would you like a cup of coffee?" "I think I would," he said. His friend poured it. "Mr. Descartes, would you like sugar in that coffee?" "I think not." And he was gone.